So I told you this, before I got started, I said, I think I'm going to like jump in to the deep end right at the beginning after we talk about your story, so we kind of find ourselves like in a cultural moment, a cultural apologetic moment, at the time of this recording, which this may or may not come out this week, but like, the controversy about the opening Olympic ceremony in Paris with the Last Supper / Dionysus, trans identity symbol, all these things, and on the online spaces, I see people from different parts of Christian thinking coming at this, so clearly from two different spaces. So how does that make sense to you? You getting connected to symbolic world, seeing the life sacramentally, that there's a symbol that was raised up at one of the most symbolic events of the world, of the world culture, having this very intense reaction. Kind of what's been your initial experience with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is a very interesting moment. And you're right that responses are all over the place. And so I think the best way to have a fruitful conversation about the opening ceremonies of the Olympics is to step back and first, understand what the Olympics are for, how art works, define some terms, right? So in other words, let's look at the telos, look at the purposes, right? So I was re-listening to recently Jonathan Pajot. He did that talk on fairy tales. It was a great talk. And at the beginning, he talks about how, what we're wrestling with in our culture is the tension between unity and diversity.
Mm-hmm.
We're celebrating diversity, okay, but if we're not going to just disintegrate and fragment into a chaos, what is the point of unity? What is actually holding us together? And that unity is formed by purpose, right? Okay, so if we're going to understand the Olympics, what is the purpose? What is the purpose that gathers the world together in a kind of unity, right? Okay, and then to understand, once we understand that purpose, then to look at, well, what's then the purpose of the opening ceremonies and how well did it fulfill that purpose, right? So when I think about the purpose of the Olympics, there is a celebration of human excellence. I mean, what are we going there to do? We're going there to see runners run fast and gymnasts, do incredible things. So to take a God-given human capacity to run, to move, and to see that capacity developed to its utmost height of excellence, right? That is, as I would understand it, what the Olympics are about. And the whole world gathers every 4 years to see and celebrate human excellence, and also human virtue, right? Because to be an excellent athlete requires courage, discipline, fortitude, prudence, right? So it's a celebration not only of physical power or physical excellence, but also, virtues, sportsmanship. There's objective standards involved in that, that we're not going to cheat on the timing, that we're going to have a fair and objective measurement of the swimmer's speeds. Okay, so it's this worldwide celebration of virtue, of human virtue. Okay, well then what would be the purpose of the opening ceremony? And I think, now that I look back and think about different ceremonies, I've been kind of comparing them and realizing that the meaning and purpose of the opening ceremonies for the Olympics has been a little bit ambiguous for a while, right? I don't know if you remember watching the Olympics that were in Russia.
Not off the top of my head, no.
And yeah, I remember people talking about at that time how much Russian propaganda there was, right? A kind of rewriting of Soviet history in order to gloss over some of those troubling spots. And so there was a bit of nationalistic propaganda to the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, I believe in Sochi. So if the Olympics are about gathering the world together and welcoming the whole world together to celebrate basic human excellence, then isn't that what the opening ceremonies ought to do through what the art is symbolizing? And I think it's in that context then that we can better understand why people are upset with concerned, unhappy with how the opening ceremonies, what they did and what they seem to symbolize, because context matters, right? So if this is just an installation piece in some room in a museum in Berlin, okay, well, the purpose of an art installation in Berlin is a different context than the central event that's going to open and visualize the purpose for which the whole world has gathered. I'm just gonna pause, see if you have a thought there.
I mean, yeah, I think that is a great way to contextualize what we're seeing. And so the question that you were kind of pointing at and posing is this a unifying symbol? And, I think that the answer to that is no, culturally, and not that certain people don't feel, seen or whatever, but like culture at large. The person that stuck out to me that's had like the most high profile response in this side of the corner is Bishop Barron. He said, and that really struck me, because a lot of times there are things culturally that we nuance, and he was just not gonna go. I mean, he was direct. He's a very winsome, and he doesn't ever sound angry in how he's talking or anything. But it was interesting, and I think that there's the, who knows. I don't want to get into the weeds of what is going on versus just looking at it, of what it looks like. And I know that there's a version that says that it's representing some Dionysius meal, and then you put it up, and you're just a rube if you think that this is, is representing the classic, Lord's Supper painting and all that kind of things. And so regardless of intent, the response speaks for itself.
Yeah.
And people maybe see what they want to see, but that's also that the fact that so many people see something one way or the other way. I mean, that just speaks to something, in that to your point about unity, and as a result, it being on some kind of fulcrum, people are falling off one side or the other. And that if you were going to choose an image to try to unify people, that was probably not the one to do it.
Right. So that's the first issue, I feel like, is what's the purpose of the opening ceremony and the Olympics? And it is the only thing our world has that we actually celebrate together. Nobody cares about the UN. Ordinary people don't follow the UN. The Olympics is really the thing that is at the height of global unity.
Yeah.
And so in this context, at this height of global unity in the opening ceremonies, you ought to, art in that. This is a festival. This is the celebration that for us sits atop of our global community.
Yeah.
Right. And what have they lifted up to that highest place of global unity? They've lifted up a death work. And, that term might need a little bit of unpacking. Okay.
Sure.
So the purpose of art in this context would be to lift up that which unifies the globe. Okay, so let's look at what they have lifted up. And if you want, the thing that sits at the highest level of a culture will be the thing that binds us. I can't think of something that sits at a higher level of global culture. Okay, so what is going to bind us? And usually it's images of human excellence, right? We got a kind of humanism sort of loosely binding the world, right? Okay, but then what have they given us? Now, what you usually need is some kind of image that will be sincere, that will actually hold up a positive truth. Okay, so maybe you have a runner running. So you have an image of athletic excellence. Go ahead.
That's just making me think about, like, what are people going to remember? And something to me is like when Muhammad Ali lit the torch, or when it was in Greece, like the torch lighting ceremony is usually or some rendition of a song, or like those are usually seen as the thing that you remember, like the flame being lit by an arrow classically when it was in Greece, and so, but this is what's going to be remembered. This is what's going to be what is going to be remembered is something that people were divided over.
Yeah. Yeah.
At the thing that was supposed to be, how can we remember something that's supposed to be powerfully unifying, is what you're saying.
Right. And why it's not unifying, I want to try and explain how this isn't arbitrary. It's not just people being thin-skinned or easily offended or projecting their own offenses. Something we talk about a lot in this little corner in the symbolic world is that, meaning isn't arbitrary. It's manifested in the structure, the way things are. Okay, so if you have an image, a positive image of a runner running fast, or the flame, those are positive images of light or the transcendence. But what images you have here? Marie Antoinette being beheaded. You have a parody of a feast. Okay, and these are what's called death works, which is a term by Philip Rieff in his Triumph of the Therapeutic. And what he says has happened to modern culture is, in trying to get away from religion, we don't have sincere belief in anything transcendent, right? And so what happens to our art is our art becomes deconstructive and ironic. It's parasitic. It's always taking an old image that actually had meaning and twisting it or subverting it, or in some way, right? So you have the picture of Marie Antoinette being beheaded. You had an old picture of excellence and aristocracy. It would be an excellence of soul, which is the old meaning of aristocracy, going back to Aristotle, right? That someone who has excellence of soul, and that, of course, they didn't always do a great job, but the monarchy and the aristocracy were supposed to be gentlemen and ladies and to model for the world excellence of soul. And, so that would be the traditional image of what Marie Antoinette, the queen, would have been. And so we take that old image that was positive, that showed us excellency of soul, and we behead it and we cover it with, red light. And you see how that's a death work. It's not offering something positive in its own light. It's only offering us a destruction of the old. And then we can look at the image of the feast. Okay, it's kind of irrelevant whether or not it's an intentional parody of the Last Supper, right? Because the meaning of a table is not arbitrary. It is deep, right? It's deep into human culture, because the table is that which gathers us around it's what gathers the society around that which feeds it, right? So we share one meal, then in a sense, we are sharing one body, right? So in that image, as we're gathered around a table that's going to tell us the thing that unifies us, well, in traditional France, in the traditional West, I mean, that was the Eucharist, the image of the table, gathering around the table as our point of unity and being fed by God, and God, Christ being the thing that binds us. That symbolic structure is simply part of the world. And so whether or not the artists who planned a table structure to their tableau intended it to be an imitation of Da Vinci's Last Supper or not is completely irrelevant, because the symbolism of the table is real. It permeates our culture, and the meaning is going to push through regardless of the conscious intent of the creator, right? Because when we're artists, we are using the things of God's world. So we kind of pause a little bit just to explain that sacramental worldview. What that is that God, the sacramental worldview is the same thing as a symbolic worldview. And what it means is that God has made this visible material world to be an expression of, a visualization of, an embodiment of spiritual truths. And we see this in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, their voice goes out to the ends of the earth. Romans 1 tells us that God's eternal power and divine nature is clearly seen in the things that he has made. And so, trees have meaning that is different than grass, and onions have meaning that is different. That there are different purposes and meanings embedded into the world God has made. And what a human artist does, as Tolkien says, we are sub-creators. God has created a meaningful world, and then we as artists, made in the image of the great artist, we take the things he's made and we form our own sub-creation. But our creations are always drawing from the meaning of the things God has made. So we can't help, an artist who creates a table setting has no control over the fact that a table setting will carry through the meaning that God has made in the world. And so what have they done? They've created a table, but what is the symbolism they've put on the table? Symbols of, what's the right word I want to say? They are symbols of deconstruction. What a drag queen is the confusion of the male and the female. Images of sexual perversity. So they've taken a table setting and turned it into a death work by subverting the traditional symbols that are simply there.
The term death work, that was helpful, because then you also use the imagery of like being a parasite onto the like an original art idea, and what the image of decomposing goes along with that. And so you were saying you begin to see that in our own culture, living in the West, and of the West of the United States, the end of the world, so to speak, the last frontier. And then we're culturally, obviously, I mean, we, from everybody's perspective, no matter what angle you're looking at, the world's changing, and has been changing now drastically. And it's funny, Jonathan Peugeot's tagline, "Symbolism happens," whether you intended it to or not. I think that's a great way to kind of say about that cultural moment, is that symbolism happened for sure. So we've talked about, you've referenced the sacramental worldview, symbolic world, which I happen to rep today, but which is why is it so important in this time in history that the world is able to move out of a modern framework into a sacramental or symbolic framework to see this world? I mean, you've already hit on it, but
Mhm.
why is it so important? Why is it maybe necessary?
Yeah, it's a good question. And maybe it can connect to one more thing I want to say about the
Yeah.
opening, the Olympic ceremony. Why is it important that we move from a modern to a symbolic? Because the modern framework doesn't work. It doesn't fit who we are and how the world works. And so by having a defective view of the world, we are starting to fall apart, right? It's not working. And it's leading us into cultural, social decomposition. And so the renewal of a true way of looking at the world is essential for life, right? Because ideas have consequences. And I wonder if I can try and unpack that a little bit by, so there at the opening ceremonies, you have raised up into the place of celebration and unity these death works, right? And part of why the drag queen imagery and the transgender imagery is so provocative and is because it's an image of disruption and revolution. There's, we can connect to Lewis a little bit here. In that hideous strength, there is a character named Mark who is being initiated into the NICE, and the NICE, and that story represents the totalitarian regime. And part of his initiation is to spend all this time in a room that is filled with surrealist art, a room that is filled with images that are off, so that he will begin to, so basically, Lewis talks about having his imagination baptized into Christianity. This is the opposite. It's trying to deform the imagination so that the imagination will no longer expect symmetry, that the imagination will no longer expect coherence, that the imagination will no longer expect beauty. So the point of surrealist art is to break your normal perceptual expectations and values so that you will no longer value one thing over the other. Bearded woman, non-bearded woman, all the same. Bacchus on the table, Christ on the table, all the same. Trying to break your sense of normal, your sense of right and wrong, your sense of beautiful versus ugly, to disrupt. I mean, that's really what the word queer is all about. We're going to queer the West. We're going to, that word is about breaking normality, right? That's why you get normative is a slur.
Mm-hmm.
And so what the image of the table with all of the gathering of the queer, right? The gathering of those who have been deconstructed so that we don't have any expectations. We're breaking our sense of normality. And then, what is at the center of the table? I just want to kind of point out the inversion that's there, right? So for a world that has known Christendom, a world that has known Christ, the table is where we gather and God offers himself. So this is a demonic parody wherein what is on the table in the Bacchus, the Bacchanalian feast, it's Bacchus himself. And he's not there to offer himself. He's there to devour, to gorge himself, to glut himself, right? So rather than an image of self-giving, it's an image of devouring, of the gluttonous self. And that we humans are mimetic, right? That means that we are made to imitate what we see. And so when you lift up such a death work into the highest place of celebration, what you're doing is saying, this is something to imitate. This death work is something to imitate. This deconstruction, disruption, queering, inversion. That is something to imitate. And that leads to self-destruction, right? When we imitate Christ, the way who leads to life, we find health and life. And when we imitate the Antichrist, right, it leads to our self-destruction. Okay, so to your question, why is this important to renew a symbolic understanding of the world? I mean, one, we need to be able to read these symbols again, so that we don't play useful idiots for those who would seek to devour and destroy, right? So that if you become symbolically illiterate, right? So the modern world is very much a stripping away of symbolic understanding, taking us down to a literal, mathematical, purely rational kind of understanding. And then we forget how to read symbols anymore. And then, but we're still mimetic, we're still imitators. So what happens is we don't know how to read symbols anymore. We're illiterate. So we just go along in the world. And then these death work symbols, these twisted symbols, these distorted symbols are put in front of us, and we're going to automatically still imitate them and absorb the meaning without consciously knowing it because we've become illiterate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that 100% makes sense. And we have been, I think one of the, as a personal thing is when I was a kid and I would see like Michelangelo's or Raphael's sculptures as a kid, it didn't strike me that much because I think there was still that part of, being from the American South. I live in Arkansas. Like, there was still a lot of this ordered life in the environment. But now when I look at it, it strikes me so much more intensely because I think what we're exposed to artistically in our culture, even though I've known about it most of my life, that I don't think it's just that I'm older and more mature to interpret this art. It's like I look at it and I think that these things are screaming louder than they did 30 years ago because of the contrast in society. And that's, I guess, hopefully that's a hopeful thing. And I think that culturally, that's why there are people moving towards sacramental realities in their life and worship. And that's a lot in this space and different things that we've talked about. And I can tell you're an educator. I'm like just sitting here like at my own personal lecture right now. So it's been very, very insightful and helpful because even as I've attempted to make this more and more of my framework, your depth on that it's another level, Annie. So I think that's I'm privileged to be able to sit here and have that conversation with you.